All right, it looks like the majority of people have joined now, so we'll get started. Hello and welcome again. My name is John Sack, and for those of you that don't know me, I'm the founding director of HighWire. Before we dive into the material, I'd like to put a tight focus on today's topic. We'll be looking at the implementation options, how it is that publishers could deliver on Plan S compliance. We won't be talking about the wisdom or the policy or the unintended or even intended consequences of Plan S. Those are important topics, and many smart people are addressing those. A number of publishers that I work with are following these two threads, implementation and policy, in parallel so they can inform their leadership, but also at the same time lay out possible workflows. I also want to note that I'd be delighted to consider questions at the end of the presentation. You can submit your questions using the questions box on the GoTo control panel. You can either do this anonymously or include your name. By the way, you may be an expert yourself. I've met many in researching Plan S, and if you have an answer to a question that you hear or a comment on something I mentioned, please send it along. I'd love it if you'd cite a source for anything that you're sure of. Some of the implementation questions about Plan S really won't be answered or answerable until Coalition S responds with clarifications in their revised guidance. Hopefully you've all received a copy of the white paper on Monday, that essentially is the text for this webinar. But if you haven't, we've attached it as a resource so you can download it from the GoTo control panel. The white paper contains more detail than I'll be able to cover in the webinar. We have just under 30 minutes for today's webinar, and this is what we're going to cover. Of course, we start with the methods section. How did we figure out what options people were considering and which were of the most interest? We'll look at that list of options from the perspective of publishers soon after the initial guidance was issued in November. Then we'll drill down on each of the 4 options that were of most interest to the academic publishers who participated in a workshop we held at the end of January. Now let's look at the timeline for coming to this understanding. HighWire has a long history of conducting ethnographic interviews, but we've most always focused on researchers, starting from our days inside Stanford. This time we turned the microphone on to publishers themselves. But of course, whose input was gathered has a lot to do with the outcomes. And so I do want to spend a minute on where we got input from. In October, I interviewed 22 people from 15 different publishing organizations, small and medium-sized, with 1 or 2 up to 50 journals. Most but not all were HighWire customers. All were nonprofit academic academic publishers, learned societies, academic organizations, etc. Some were highly selective, like Science and BMJ, and others very selective, or some very broad. Most already had 1 or more OA journals in their suite, and there are many, many hybrid journals among the group. The disciplines were all STEM, but were not all biomedical. It turned out we learned that disciplines do matter, even within STEM, since in some disciplines the direction of travel, as people use the phrase, was said to point to OA, but we did find some disciplines where that's just not so. Then in mid-December, this group of publishers I interviewed voted on the options I summarized from their interviews so that we and they could figure out which were most important to cover in our late January workshop. Then on January 29th, we held a workshop, everyone around a single large table, everyone participating. We did that to present and debate the options. Then the group voted again at the end of the workshop to see which options were of most interest to most publishers. I should comment that the right option for your organization might not be among the most popular options our group discussed in the workshop. Your specific situation might take you in a different direction from those popular options, especially if you have some unusual characteristics such as barriers to OA or a very high or very low percentage of articles affected by Plan S. Here are the 14 options that came out of the initial interviews. They're presented in the order of publisher preference, least to most, as of mid-December. You can see the score for each option at the bottom of the box. The higher the score, the more preferred the option. The description of the options is presented in the white paper, and I won't go into much detail about them in the interest of time. But let me just say a sentence about each of them. So the first is, should publishers field their own compliant repository rather than relying on other repositories that are already out there? The second, stay the course, is really business as usual, means no special changes to accommodate Plan S authors or policies. The third option, the mirror option, uses the same editorial board to operate an OA only or Plan S only journal. Now, this option was specifically disallowed by the implementation group, but it had come up in our surveys prior to that. Next was flipping journals, and flips of long established impactful journals from subscriptions to open access are rare, but they have been done. And the main debate around this was, if you see that eventually this direction of travel is headed in this direction, maybe you should start planning for it now. The menu of publishing services was a route to handling capped APCs, offer a suite of services for additional fees. Just as in previous decades, publishers had color figures enabled by paying color charges. Transformative agreements, this is a route for journal compliance in Plan S that's open to hybrid journals, but the hybrid has a fixed term life. Preprints, the question here was, could an author with publisher permission post a preprint of the final accepted manuscript and be compliant, essentially using the preprint server as a repository? Now on the second row, transparent hybrid subscription pricing. There was a hope pre-implementation guidance that hybrids could be continued if they were transparent about how OA, the portion of open access articles in the journal affected subscription prices to avoid the charge of double dipping. The second one on the bottom row, transfer to an OA journal. Here, publishers could offer a Plan S author an OA venue that is a different journal that they could publish in via the transfer. Read and publish agreements. These agreements tie cost to publish open access with the cost to subscribe. And certainly larger publishers are pursuing this, but they're usually geographically focused. Deposit to an existing compliance server. Here, the question was, would green open access be compliant, and where would those articles go? And would some publishers actually want to enable this service, that is, perform it as a service? Publish ahead of print with final author-accepted manuscripts. Author-accepted manuscripts are now being published open access on a journal site by several publishers, and the question was, is this a route to compliance? Transparent APC pricing. If there are hard or soft caps that are going to come in on APCs, the thinking here is that the only way to get past those for very selective journals would be to demonstrate the appropriateness of the APC. And then finally, bottom right was Green OA itself, without an embargo and with CC BY offering authors a path to compliance. So in the workshop, the top 11 of 14 options were presented by individuals who could speak to the pros and cons of their option, followed by discussion and then question development. And we were developing questions specifically for feedback to Coalition S. At the end of the day's workshop, as I said, we ran a survey again that told us what options were now of interest to the most publishers. Now let's see what the top options were after our workshop, and then we're going to focus on those. This is in the same order as the previous slide, but now we've highlighted the top options post-workshop. On the bottom row are the three options that had the highest score after the workshop. And you can see the scores now post-workshop are the bottom right of each box. The highest ranked three post-workshop were using Green OA to comply. Second was, that was the highest. Second was deposit to an existing compliant server or repository. And the third was publish ahead of print with the final author accepted manuscript. I've also included one that wasn't in the top 3, but it moved up 7 places in the ranking, and that's on the top row, stay the course for now. In our latest survey, it had risen from the number 13 of 14 options to number 6 in order of preference. And we'll talk about why that might be. Before we dive in, I think it's really good to keep the implementation guidance top level 3 paths summary in mind. A lot seems to depend on how this is interpreted, but at least at the top level, it's pretty clear. The summary is from the perspective of authors, as you can see from the wording, but it does lay out paths to becoming a compliant journal on the left and on the right, most columns. The left is for OA journals, the right is for these term-limited hybrids moving to flip to OA. And in the middle is the option for authors and potentially for publishers to deposit articles. So the middle path is an article compliance path for authors to publish anywhere that offers them the necessary options, such as CC BY. Now, there is a question about how do you know which repositories are authorized, and we'll talk about that as we go forward. I think a lot of confusion, maybe some it's just mine, is in the difference between publishing compliant articles, which is in the middle of this 3 options, and publishing in compliant journals, which is on the left or on the right. And of course, publishers care about the difference between publishing in compliant journals and publishing compliant articles. The devil's in the details in scholarship and in publishing, and our group of workshop participants developed 27 questions needing clarification in the implementation guidance. And like about 1,000 others, we submitted these questions into the feedback process. Now I want to start drilling into each of these 4 options that I highlighted on a previous slide. The first 3 will be the top ranked options, so that you can see how the discussion in our meeting, in our workshop, looked at each of these. So using Green OA to comply, Green OA is not specifically mentioned, at least I don't believe it is, in the implementation guidance, and that's because it's usually associated with an embargo period, but that's not true in this case. Note here that the role of the publisher is to set the rules, presumably updating their Sherpa Romeo entry with the information about what they allow. The role of the author in this option is to actually make the deposit. The next option changes this, though, and the publisher would specify not only that the author can use this option, but what it is that they can deposit. And unlike normal, if you will, Green OA, there has to be immediate free access, and it looks like it needs to be CC BY. Now, as happened with the early days of PubMed Central, confusion might arise about which article version, who, when, where, and how to deposit. And we think that we're much smarter now. We've learned from PubMed Central about how to avoid some of this, but probably some of it's just going to happen. Publishers would need to choose whether authors can deposit author-accepted manuscripts or the version of record. Probably not a choice. You probably want to be clear about which it is. There's still debate 20 years after the launch of PubMed Central about which is best from a publisher standpoint, from the standpoint of the science. And we need to ensure that if the author deposits one version to a particular repository and the publisher deposits another version, that there isn't any kind of conflict between the two that's going to happen. In other words, if an author is depositing an author-accepted manuscript to PubMed Central to be compliant with Plan S, but the publisher deposits the version of record to be compliant with the NIH rules, does anything break? The second of the top-ranked options is deposit to an existing compliant server or repository. Publishers here take on the burden to actually do the deposit. The previous option essentially says the publisher sets the rules, but does not actually take on the burden to do the deposit. Publishers have been debating whether they should take on the burden as they would in this option. Some publishers think that given the downward pressure on APCs, they really should not be taking on new burdens that will add new cost, especially in the early days where it's likely that you're going to take on the burden of education as well as workflow. There's the same decision as before about whether to deposit the accepted manuscript or the version of record. In considerations, there's probably the same consideration that we had early in the PubMed Central days, and it's whether to undertake this kind of deposit only for those articles where it's mandated, for example, Plan S articles, or do you treat all your original research the same? And HighWire works with publishers who've decided differently on this question, so it's still open for debate. And under questions, there's a new question here about whether repositories gain traffic from having versions that the publisher doesn't have on their journal site. So is it best essentially for the publisher to take whatever they're going to deposit and also make sure it's accessible using the same rules on the journal site? And the answer to this might depend on whether Plan S gains significant new signatories or not. If it's 3 or 4 or 5% of your articles, you might decide this one way. If it's 20 or 30 or 40% of your articles, you might decide another. And there's also the concern about getting correct funder information to drive the workflow. The jury is still out on how to best get authors to indicate this, or whether it's best just to have copy editing figure it out. Now, the third option is perhaps the most intriguing. It's a great example of new questions emerging as people think through the more obvious options. And what we found here is that there are several HighWire hosted publishers who are already operating in the spirit of immediate free access to author accepted manuscripts by posting them to their journal sites immediately on acceptance. Some other publishers had considered this, but assumed that it would drive subscription decline, particularly if it was done for all original research. But 2 of the publishers who've been doing this for 20 years were able to look at their data, and they believe there's no subscription decline attributable to this model. I go into this a bit more in the white paper. So the questions now are really whether this model will or won't be compliant. Essentially, this needs to get sorted out with Plan S details, and a number of questions in our feedback to Plan S are about this option. The concept that the journals doing this have is that the journal is essentially its own repository for the green OA author accepted manuscript. Now let's look at the fourth option, which is really not an implementation option per se, but I've moved it up. It moved up very strongly in the rankings, so I thought we should actually include it in the discussion. I think this is a response to the ambiguity people saw during the workshop as they dug into the guidance and listened to others' questions and comments. So for some publishers, this will be a temporary place until there's more clarification coming from the implementation guidance. For others, it might persist for quite a while as they figure out their plans relative to the implementation guidance. So for example, if I think that I'm going to flip my journals, maybe I don't want to do anything for now until I can get the right plan in place. The questions here have to do with some very specific rules that seem to be unclear in the guidance. Principles lead you to believe one thing. The guidance is actually not as explicit as we would have thought. So, for example, are hybrid journals off limits for Plan S APC funds, or is it off limits to publish a paper that has some Plan S funding in a hybrid journal, assuming that it meets other kinds of, for example, it's got green OA, that is one of the other options that I've already described, operate. Is there an actual prohibition on publishing in a hybrid journal, or is it simply saying no, we Plan S will not pay any APCs for that? The principle says hybrid is incompatible. That certainly suggests that you can't put a Plan S article in a hybrid journal at all, but the actual guidance doesn't seem to be that explicit about it. There are also questions, and this came up over and over again, about multi-author situations. Can one author on a paper use non-Plan S funds to publish open access in a hybrid journal? And if that article goes on to a compliant repository, for example, PubMed Central, is the article now compliant? And so we ask these kinds of questions in our feedback. Another one that people were trying to figure out is, if you stay the course for now, is that an advantage or a disadvantage? That is there an early or late adopter advantage or disadvantage in figuring this out early? So let's look at a few of the topics that turned out to be questions. Let me get all the questions up here. Oop. There we go. It's perhaps almost too obvious, so I didn't put it in the list of questions. But the question that everyone wants to know, but no one does know, is how far is Plan S going to proliferate? What's going to happen in China? Some people say, oh, China has expressed support, but that's not the same as signing. What's going to happen in the U.S. In terms of major U.S. funders? But also in terms of government funders. And with that jury still out, it's a number of publishers, I think, are actually sitting on the fence saying we really can't decide yet. So let's look at the more substantive questions that came up in the workshop beyond the one about distribution of Plan S. The top three options are really pretty similar and suggest that publishers are leaning toward a particular path. The middle path, deposit for the author or allow the deposit. This is something that people are familiar with from PubMed Central, so maybe they say, okay, we get it. We have the workflow already in place, even though there's no embargo. Second, popular, that is what I've looked at is the three most, if you will, popular options, but that's not really the whole story. It turns out that 40% of the publishers are considering, of the publishers that were in our group, are considering transformative agreements. They just look very hard to do, so they didn't put it at the very top of their list. A third of them are looking at, but are not committed to, flipping their journals to OA. This again has to do with the concept of direction of travel. The next bullet about your views on direction of travel is critical in looking forward. If you believe that this is the way things are going, I should just be planning to get there properly, then you might choose one set of options. But if you say, no, this is not working, this is not happening in my industry, my hybrid or non-hybrid is good enough, then you'd probably go a different way. We have some publishers who have experience publishing author-accepted manuscripts and or CC BY licenses, and they see it as no big deal. So they are, I wouldn't say all of them. In fact, we just have a few in each of these categories, but there is some evidence that they have that it works for them. So if you don't see these as a big deal, you might not focus on other options. You might pick one of these. And then the big question is, where do you believe your value as a journal or publisher really comes from? Is it in the content itself? Is it in your commentary, your context, your selectivity, other services, and so on? We also had questions about the role of individual funders, and is it the funder who is going to provide implementation details to authors, or is Plan S going to do it? Right now, it looks like that's a funder role. And I mentioned already the question about multiple authors and multiple funders and whether this provides any flexibility. There was a question about publishers saying, hey, we'll just, we'll make one of these choices about implementation option, but we'll apply it only to Plan S articles rather than to our entire original research output. And then I think there's a question of what have we learned from 20 years of PubMed Central experience? And do we really know that there are certain things that work well, certain things that might be complicated, but only for the first 18 months as things sort of shake out and authors and publishers get used to something new. So those are the questions that we had. As I said, there were 27 questions we submitted to the Plan S feedback. I could not have assembled this information without the people who participated in the workshop, and I really want to thank them for not only showing up at the workshop, but in many of the cases speaking about one of the options. So now we have just a few minutes for questions, just 2 or 3 minutes. As I said at the beginning, if we don't have time to answer them, or if they simply don't have answers, we'll try and address this in an email. So if you do have questions, go ahead and put them into the go-to control panel, and we'll try and get to them either today or at a later date. And let's take a look at some of the questions we have. So one of the questions was about the feedback that we submitted. And obviously, I'm not going to go into 27 different questions, but I can tell you that the feedback that we submitted had to do with, let's see, it looks like 6 areas. Compliance requirements and rules, compliance monitoring and enforcement, transformative agreements, which were, they feel complicated to the small and medium-sized publishers that we work with. They look at read and publish deals as something that works well for very large publishers, but they're interested in the concept. They're just trying to see how they would implement it. Another major topic was APCs, and will there actually be a cap? There was a question about caps themselves. There were 2 philosophical questions. There's no other way to describe them. One asking, essentially, really, mirror journals won't work? Why is that? Question about transparency and how to make your costs transparent. This seems very complicated without some further guidance. And then an other category, in particular asking about what is the OA conversion funding and help for academic societies and publishers and nonprofit publishers that Coalition S is considering. Because with help, some publishers might consider other types of options. There's a question about transformative agreements. And someone noticed, somebody really sharp-eyed noticed that in our pre-workshop and post-workshop voting, there was a big drop in interest in read and publish agreements. Why is that? I think there are 2 issues here. that came up. One is that these types of agreements, for example, the Wiley deal agreement that just came out in mid-January, seems to favor scale. That is, large publishers who can aggregate over a large number of journals might have a better ability to deal with read and publish. So that was one of the issues that small and medium publishers saw. And the second is that it wasn't entirely clear how, and this is, I would say, this is still unclear to me, how read and publish agreements essentially lead you to transformative agreements. It feels like you would need to have a number of them that account for more than 50% of your articles before you would have a transformative agreement really feasible for a small and medium-sized publisher. So those two issues seem to me to be what was behind the drop in interest in read and publish agreements. But as I say, there's still a third to 40% of the publishers are still somewhat interested in understanding transformative agreements. So we're out of time now. There are, it looks like, about another dozen questions. And I will be glad to try and answer those as best I can without admitting too much that there are some that I don't know the answer to, but I will always be glad to get input from others. So if I post an answer that's incomplete and you have a better answer, I would really love to see the answer from you, or just more advice and guidance. So thank you very much for your time and attention, and I'll be glad for feedback as well as questions on this. sac@highwire.org if you have any feedback specifically that isn't in the form of a question. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you again.